The train screeched to a halt under the blistering Texas sun. Its windows were barred, its compartments filled not with cattle or freight, but with weary men in worn field gray uniforms. They were soldiers of the Wehrmacht, Afrika Korps veterans captured under the burning skies of North Africa. Dust clung to their boots, fear lingered in their eyes. They had fought hard for Hitler and Rommel, and now, halfway across the world, they had no idea what awaited them. When the doors swung open, the men braced themselves. For weeks they had whispered grim predictions. Nazi propaganda had painted Americans as brutal, greedy, and merciless. They expected whips, chains, and humiliation. Some even feared execution. But what they found instead would shake the foundations of everything they had been taught. The guards waiting outside weren't brandishing clubs. They weren't screaming insults. Instead, they calmly directed the Germans toward orderly rows of wooden barracks, freshly built with bunks, showers, and even mess halls. And then, almost unbelievably, they were handed paper, envelopes, and pencils. An American officer explained, through an interpreter, that each man could write a letter home. Not once, not as a reward, but regularly. The Germans stared in disbelief. Letters? To Germany? To their wives, their mothers, their children, while the war still raged. For many, it was the first crack in a wall of fear that had surrounded them since capture. One young private, barely 20, later recalled how he froze when the paper touched his hands. For weeks he had imagined his mother searching casualty lists, wondering if he lay dead under the desert sand. And now, by order of his enemy, he could tell her he was alive. He wrote with trembling fingers, "I am safe. I have food. I am treated well. Do not worry." In that moment, a paradox revealed itself. These men had been trained to see Americans as soulless enemies, yet here they were, alive, fed, and free to reach across the ocean with words of reassurance. It was shocking, it was unthinkable, and it was deliberate. Why would America, in the middle of a brutal global war, allow its captured enemies to send letters home freely? Was this some trick of propaganda? A clever trap to lure them into lowering their guard? Or was it something deeper, a demonstration of a strength the Nazis could never match? This act of unexpected generosity, small on the surface, monumental in its impact, would ripple through families in Germany, unsettle hardened Nazi convictions, and leave lasting impressions that outlived the war itself. For many captured Germans, it was not the American tanks or bombers that shook them most. It was the strange and disarming freedom of being allowed to write words of hope onto a blank page. This is the story of how the United States, in ways quiet but powerful, used humanity itself as a weapon of war. The Second World War was a conflict of extremes. Entire nations were consumed, cities turned to rubble, and tens of millions of lives were lost. It was a war where ideology clashed with survival, and where propaganda shaped how soldiers viewed both themselves and their enemies. To understand why German prisoners were so shocked at being allowed to write letters home from America, we must first understand the world they came from and the expectations they carried across the Atlantic. For years, Nazi propaganda had drilled into the minds of its soldiers a very specific image of the enemy. Americans, they were told, were a mongrel people, greedy and materialistic, ruled by money and corrupted by racial mixing. According to Joseph Goebbels' Ministry of Propaganda, the United States was decadent and weak, too divided, too disorganized, too consumed by luxury to be a serious threat. And yet, beneath the sneering arrogance, there was also a darker warning whispered among the ranks. If captured, Germans could expect brutal treatment. Tales of American lynch mobs, of starving prisoners, of cruelty by black soldiers. These were the stories used to steel German hearts for the possibility of defeat. At the same time, many of these young men had seen firsthand how Germany treated its own prisoners of war. On the Eastern Front, Soviet POWs were subjected to unimaginable horror. Mass executions, forced marches, starvation so severe that entire camps became charnel houses. Millions perished, forgotten in fields and forests. Even British and American prisoners inside Germany, while often better off than Soviet captives, still faced shortages, harsh discipline, and fear of reprisal. The rules of the Geneva Convention were twisted or ignored when it suited the Reich. So when these German soldiers found themselves in American hands, Their minds were prepared for the worst. They expected the brutality they had witnessed, and perhaps even deserved in their own eyes, after what their nation had inflicted on others. They braced for hunger, for humiliation, for punishment. But what they discovered was something radically different. The United States, unlike most nations embroiled in the conflict, was not fighting on its own soil. American cities had not been reduced to rubble, its farmland had not been scorched, its industries had not been dismantled. Instead, America was thriving as the arsenal of democracy. Its factories poured out tanks, ships, and aircraft at a rate that stunned the world. Its people enjoyed an abundance of food, clothing, and resources unmatched by any other nation at war. And, crucially, America had both the resources and the will to abide by international law. From the very beginning, the U.S. government made the decision to follow the Geneva Convention regarding prisoners of war. Camps would be built, food would be provided, medical care given, and, most surprisingly, communication with families would be allowed under strict censorship. This was not just a gesture of kindness. It was a calculated decision, designed to demonstrate America's strength and to subtly undermine enemy morale. For the Germans, however, the effect was deeply personal. To be taken thousands of miles from the front, to survive the Atlantic crossing, and then to be given the chance to write home, it was almost beyond comprehension. In a world where war often meant silence and disappearance, a letter meant life. It meant a voice carried across oceans, breaking through the fog of battle and propaganda. And that is why this story matters. Because the act of writing letters, mundane, almost trivial in peacetime, became a profound weapon in wartime. It revealed the contrast between Nazi cruelty and American confidence, between a dictatorship built on fear and a democracy willing to extend even its enemies a form of dignity. In this documentary, we will follow the journey of these German prisoners, from the deserts of North Africa to the camps of Texas, Oklahoma, and the Midwest, from their first stunned letters home to the ripple effects those words had on families in bombed-out German cities. We will explore the policies, the psychology, and the consequences of this extraordinary decision. For the German POWs, the letters were more than just words on a page. They were symbols of survival, of America's abundance, and of a moral strength their own nation could not match. And so we return to the question, why would America, at the height of total war, allow its enemies this freedom? The answer, as we will see, lies not only in law and policy, but in the very nature of the conflict itself. The story begins in the barren deserts of North Africa in 1942 and 1943. The Afrika Korps, once seen as the pride of Germany under Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, had fought with grit and skill against the British Eighth Army. But the arrival of American troops, combined with the overwhelming Allied supply lines, shifted the tide. Operation Torch in late 1942 opened a new front, and soon thousands of German soldiers found themselves surrounded, cut off, and outnumbered. When the inevitable surrenders came, German soldiers were bewildered. For many, it was their first direct contact with Americans. Some expected immediate execution. Others imagined brutal marches through the desert or imprisonment in fetid tents. Instead, they were loaded onto ships, vessels far more stable and sanitary than the transports they had known in Europe, and carried across the Atlantic to a destination few had even imagined, the heart of the United States itself. The journey was surreal. Days on the ocean blurred together, the prisoners kept under guard but given rations, medical checks, and even the chance to stretch on deck. Many whispered among themselves, was this some elaborate trick? Perhaps they were being lulled into false security, only to be thrown into hidden dungeons upon arrival. But when the ships finally docked, the reality was stranger still. They were put on trains that cut through endless plains and forests, past farms bursting with crops and towns where children waved as the trains thundered by. Few Americans had ever seen a German soldier up close, and yet there was no jeering, no stones thrown, no rage. The sight of abundance was already a shock. While rationing existed in the U.S., it paled compared to the scarcities in Europe. To German eyes, the overflowing fields and fat cattle were almost insulting in their richness. Finally, the train stopped at sprawling compounds surrounded not by barbed wire fences stretching into wastelands, but by orderly campgrounds with barracks, guard towers, and, most astonishingly, facilities that resembled military bases more than prisons. The camps were built to house thousands, with long wooden barracks lined with bunks, mess halls with kitchens, latrines with running water, and even recreational areas. German prisoners found that their food rations were not only adequate but generous. Meat, bread, vegetables, even coffee. It was a far cry from the watery soup and crusts of bread they had often been given in the field. One German sergeant later recalled his amazement upon being served breakfast: 2 eggs, bacon, toast, and milk. It was more than my family in Germany had seen in weeks. Another prisoner wrote that the meals in American captivity felt like a cruel joke, too rich to be true. But nothing compared to the moment when paper and envelopes were handed out. An interpreter explained, each prisoner was allowed to write letters home. These would be censored for sensitive information, but otherwise permitted. They could reassure their families, inform them of their health, and even describe life in the camps within limits. The silence was heavy. Men looked at each other, suspicious. Some feared a trap, that their words would be twisted, their families punished. Others felt overwhelmed, unable to believe it. Slowly, pencils scratched across pages, and the words flowed. The first wave of letters sent back to Germany in 1943 were brief but powerful. I am alive. I am well. I am treated fairly. For wives who feared themselves widows, for parents who feared their sons rotted in mass graves, these words carried the weight of salvation. Some prisoners dared to add details that slipped past the censors, descriptions of plentiful food, of medical care, of humane treatment. Families in bombed-out German cities could scarcely believe it. Their sons, captured by the Americans, were living better than they were at home. For the POWs, this act of writing was not just communication, it was liberation. A soldier who had been reduced to a number, stripped of weapons and rank, could still send words across an ocean. He still had a voice. The contrast could not have been sharper. Many of these same soldiers had marched Russian captives to their deaths. They had seen Red Army prisoners starve in open fields, reduced to skeletons within weeks. In the eyes of German doctrine, the Slavs were untermenschen, subhumans unworthy of mercy. Soviet POWs died by the millions in camps where disease and cannibalism ran rampant. Now, the Germans themselves were in captivity and treated with dignity. It was disorienting. Some refused to believe it was genuine. They waited for the mask to slip, for the brutality to begin. But it never came. The letters became the first cracks in the wall of Nazi ideology. Soldiers who had swallowed propaganda whole now faced undeniable evidence. Their supposed barbaric enemies were feeding them, housing them, and letting them write freely. For men who had fought with conviction, the realization was disturbing. For others, it was a quiet relief. One camp officer later remembered, the Americans were clever. They didn't need to beat us. They only needed to show us how they lived. It is difficult today to grasp the weight of those first letters. In an era without instant communication, without internet or phones, letters were the only lifeline across continents. For many POWs, the act of writing was more important than food or comfort. It was proof that they still existed. It gave them dignity when everything else had been stripped away. And for the families in Germany, those letters were both comfort and confusion. Comfort, because their sons were alive. Confusion, because what they described contradicted the picture painted by Nazi media. How could America, supposedly weak and savage, afford such generosity? Unbeknownst to many prisoners, America had long understood the power of these letters. Every word was read by censors, every phrase cataloged. But more than that, the policy was a weapon of soft power. By treating prisoners well and allowing them to write home, the U.S. projected confidence. It showed not only military might, but moral superiority. The German POWs had no way of knowing it yet, but their words would soon ripple back into the Reich itself, undermining Nazi propaganda and planting seeds of doubt in a nation under siege. What began as shock and disbelief in the first days of captivity would, over the years, grow into something much larger, a quiet but profound transformation in how these men saw the world, their enemy, and even themselves. By 1944, the system had expanded far beyond a handful of camps. Nearly 400,000 German prisoners were scattered across the United States, From the pine forests of Arkansas to the plains of Nebraska, from Louisiana swamps to the prairies of the Midwest. Entire rural communities suddenly found themselves hosting former enemies, and what unfolded often surprised both sides. The scale itself was staggering. America not only fed and clothed its own soldiers, but also tens of thousands of captives. Camps were laid out with military precision, barracks arranged in rows, guard towers overlooking the grounds, and barbed wire encircling the perimeter. But within those fences, a routine life emerged. Prisoners rose at dawn, ate hearty breakfasts, and were often assigned work details that benefited local economies. They picked cotton, harvested wheat, built roads, and chopped timber. Farmers welcomed the extra hands, especially as young American men were overseas fighting. The letters continued to flow, a steady stream of words carried across the ocean by the International Red Cross. Each prisoner was allowed to write a certain number each month, and though every line was carefully censored, the essence of the message was always the same. They were alive, they were fed, and they were safe. In bombed-out German cities, these messages brought relief bordering on disbelief. Wives who queued for bread and mothers who endured air raids would clutch those letters as lifelines. They contrasted starkly with the grim silence from the Eastern Front, where Soviet captivity almost always meant death. For the German soldiers themselves, the ability to write freely was more than just comfort. It was a daily reminder of their captors' strange generosity. One prisoner described his astonishment when a censor actually handed back his letter with a smile, politely asking him to rephrase a sentence that revealed too much about camp layout. Instead of punishment, he found cooperation. It was a small moment, but it symbolized something larger. The Americans were enforcing rules, not cruelty. The psychological impact deepened as months turned into years. Many prisoners entered captivity hardened in their beliefs, convinced of Nazi ideology and the superiority of the Reich. Yet the simple act of being allowed to communicate openly began to erode those convictions. A man who could reassure his wife that he was safe in America could no longer easily believe that his captors were monsters. Instead, doubt crept in, about the stories told by Goebbels, about the morality of the regime he had served, and even about his own place in the war. Not all prisoners welcomed this change. Hardline Nazis within the camps worked to maintain control. They formed secret cells, monitored fellow Germans, and sometimes violently punished those who appeared soft toward the Americans. In certain camps, this tension boiled over, with prisoners beaten or even killed by their own countrymen for expressing admiration of their captors or for suggesting that the war might be lost. Yet even these brutal acts could not erase the daily evidence of American abundance. The holidays provided some of the most striking examples. At Christmas, guards permitted POWs to hold services, decorate barracks, and even receive special meals. For men who had left families under bombardment, it was a bittersweet but unforgettable gesture. Some American guards even shared in the celebrations, exchanging songs or gifts. In such moments, the distance between captor and captive narrowed. German soldiers began to see Americans not as caricatures of propaganda, but as human beings, and sometimes even as friends. Meanwhile, the letters themselves became a form of quiet propaganda, though not in the way the Nazis intended. Families in Germany read about full plates of food while they rationed scraps. They learned their sons were healthy while children at home withered from hunger. The dissonance was powerful. Some began to question the regime's endless promises of victory when the reality, described in their own sons' handwriting, painted America as not only strong but magnanimous. This was not lost on Allied planners. The decision to allow letters was never just humanitarian. It was psychological warfare of the most subtle kind. By permitting German prisoners to tell the truth, within limits, the United States spread doubt inside the Reich without dropping a single bomb. Every message was a seed planted in German soil, a whisper that contradicted the thunder of Nazi propaganda. And as the war dragged on, those whispers grew louder. By late 1944, as Allied forces pushed into France and Germany itself came under siege, the significance of these letters only increased. For German prisoners thousands of miles away, the war became a distant echo, filtered through Red Cross updates and the slow rhythm of camp life. Yet they knew that their words still mattered. that their families clung to each envelope as proof of hope. And for many, this realization began to transform their understanding of the conflict itself. The Americans had shown that power did not have to manifest as cruelty. Instead, it could reveal itself in generosity, in confidence, in a willingness to extend dignity even to one's enemies. It was a lesson that unsettled the prisoners at first, but over time, it left a mark far deeper than bullets or bombs ever could. For many German prisoners, the longer captivity stretched, the more profound the consequences became. The ability to write home had begun as a shock, then settled into routine, and finally evolved into something transformative. What had first been seen as a trick of propaganda became a trusted bridge between two worlds, between a soldier in a camp in Texas or Nebraska and a mother waiting in a bombed-out street in Hamburg. The letters shaped not only the morale of individual prisoners, but also the perception of entire communities back in Germany. Families who had braced themselves for silence or death notices instead received reassurances. Some even received descriptions of America's staggering abundance: meals of meat and vegetables, clean uniforms, and work opportunities that allowed their sons to earn small wages. In a nation where starvation was tightening its grip, those accounts were hard to reconcile with the Nazi vision of America as weak and collapsing. The German regime, of course, grew uneasy. Censors within Germany sometimes blacked out phrases that hinted at too much comfort, too much food, or too much humanity. Yet the truth seeped through, line by line, in the handwriting of husbands, fathers, and sons. And among the prisoners themselves, this freedom created divisions. Hardline Nazis tried desperately to maintain discipline within the camps. They warned fellow captives not to believe American tricks and threatened violence against those who spoke openly of their admiration for the enemy. In some camps, intimidation turned deadly. Prisoners who suggested that Germany might lose the war, or who expressed respect for America's treatment, were beaten or even murdered by their comrades. The camps became microcosms of the collapsing Reich, a mix of blind loyalty, quiet resistance, and growing disillusion. For many ordinary soldiers, however, the letters became a form of therapy. Captivity was a limbo, a place where their future was uncertain and their past haunted them. Writing gave them a sense of purpose, a reminder of their identity beyond the uniform. Some wrote poems to their wives, others sketches for their children. They poured into words the longing, guilt, and relief of survival. The act of writing did not erase the war, but it humanized them again. They were no longer cogs in a machine of conquest. They were men, reaching out across oceans to those they loved. And what they described carried immense weight. Families who opened those envelopes often found details that contrasted bitterly with their own existence. A mother in Cologne might receive a letter that read, "I am in good health. We eat well. Do not worry." Yet outside her window lay ruins, ration lines, and fear of the next bombing raid. That dissonance gnawed at faith in Nazi promises. If the enemy could afford to feed prisoners so lavishly, what hope did Germany have? The long-term impact would be profound. After the war ended, many of these former prisoners returned to Germany with memories of America that defied the Nazi caricature. They had seen farms bursting with food, towns where strangers treated them decently, guards who enforced rules without cruelty. They had been allowed to write freely, even encouraged to do so. For many, this was their first real glimpse of democracy, not just as an idea, but as a lived experience of fairness and dignity. These impressions lingered. In the years of rebuilding West Germany, countless ex-POWs who had once feared America now became advocates for cooperation and friendship. But this transformation was not without resistance. For some prisoners, particularly those steeped in Nazi ideology, the experience of generosity created only bitterness. They interpreted kindness as arrogance, as the enemy flaunting its strength. Yet even they could not deny the abundance they had witnessed, the freedom of communication they had been granted. In the end, whether welcomed or resented, the experience left its mark. The policy of allowing letters had begun as adherence to international law, but its effects rippled far beyond. It quietly undermined the Nazi regime's control of truth. It gave prisoners a sense of dignity that no amount of barbed wire could strip away. And it planted seeds of change in the very men who had once fought to destroy the United States. What was intended as discipline became transformation. What began as suspicion turned into a lesson. And for thousands of German soldiers, the simple act of writing became the most unexpected chapter of their war. It happened quietly, without fanfare, yet for those who lived it, the moment was unforgettable. In one camp in the Midwest, a German officer who had been captured in Tunisia finally received a letter back from his wife. He had written to her weeks earlier, unsure if the message would ever survive the perilous journey across oceans and through warring nations. One morning, during mail call, his name was called out. He stepped forward, hands trembling, and took the envelope. The handwriting was hers. Against all odds, her words had reached him, and his had reached her. For a few minutes, he was no longer a prisoner. He was a husband, a father, a man with a family still tethered to him despite the war. The camp fell silent as he read, tears forming in his eyes. She spoke of their children, of the hardships in their bombed-out city, of her relief at knowing he was alive. It was proof that their worlds were still connected, that the ocean had not severed their bond. The power of that moment was not lost on anyone. Here was a German officer, defeated and disarmed, holding in his hand a letter that had crossed borders, censorship offices, Red Cross couriers, and still arrived intact. It was as though America itself had carried his wife's words to him. And what shocked him most was not just that the letter had come. It was that his captors had allowed it, had facilitated it, had respected it. The contrast with life back home could not have been greater. German civilians were enduring shortages so severe that bread was stretched with sawdust, and children scavenged in ruins for food. Cities burned under relentless Allied bombing campaigns. Yet inside the barbed wire of American camps, the prisoners ate bread with butter, meat several times a week, vegetables, even fruit. They could read, play sports, and above all, write and receive letters. The imbalance was staggering. For many prisoners, this was the true turning point. At first they had seen kindness as weakness, or simply as a temporary mask. But when letters began to return from home, when the connection was proven real, the realization sank in. This was not weakness. This was power of a kind they had never imagined. Only a nation supremely confident in its strength could afford such generosity toward its enemies. The letters themselves became symbols of that power. A single page of reassurance said more than tanks or planes ever could. It showed that America not only had the means to fight a world war, but also the resources to care for those it captured. It revealed a moral authority that contrasted sharply with the brutality Germans themselves had inflicted on others. Some prisoners spoke of an almost terrifying realization. If America could treat them so well while waging total war, what hope did Germany truly have? Their own nation, they knew, could never have shown such restraint. The Reich had built its power on fear and cruelty. The Americans, by contrast, revealed their strength through mercy. And so the emotional turning point was reached. For many German POWs, the moment of receiving a letter from home, made possible by their captors, changed everything. They no longer saw the Americans as faceless enemies. They saw them as formidable adversaries, yes, but also as human beings who fought with confidence and conscience. That combination was more unsettling than any weapon. In those moments, the fear of American guns was joined by awe at American abundance and the unsettling recognition of America's moral weight. The prisoners had not only lost the war on the battlefield, they had lost it in their hearts as well. In the end, the story of German prisoners writing letters home from America is not just a curious footnote in the vast history of the Second World War. It is a reminder of how wars are fought on multiple fronts, not all of them marked by gunfire. Those letters were more than paper and ink. They were messages of survival, fragments of humanity preserved in a time when humanity was scarce. They reassured families, contradicted propaganda, and quietly revealed the strength of a nation that chose generosity over vengeance. For the United States, allowing German POWs to write was a decision rooted in law, practicality, and strategy. It followed the Geneva Convention, it kept prisoners occupied and stable, and it projected America's image of confidence. But the unintended consequence was even more powerful. Those letters undermined the Nazi regime's grip on truth. When mothers and wives in Germany compared what they saw on the ground, bombing raids, food shortages, despair, With the words their loved ones wrote about life in America, the contrast was devastating. The Reich promised glory and survival. The letters revealed cracks in that illusion. For the prisoners themselves, the experience left scars and lessons that lasted long after the war. Many carried back to Germany not only memories of abundance, but also an awareness of fairness, discipline, and democracy. These men became part of the generation that rebuilt West Germany, and in countless interviews and memoirs they admitted that captivity in America had altered their worldview. The kindness they experienced forced them to reconsider what strength meant. Strength was not simply domination. It could also be restraint, justice, and dignity. Of course, not all prisoners were transformed. Some clung to ideology, interpreting kindness as arrogance or manipulation. But even they could not deny the evidence of their own senses. They had eaten well in captivity, worked alongside Americans, and written letters that crossed the ocean and returned with words of love. These facts lived on, etched into memory. Historians now look back and see those letters as one of the quietest but most effective tools of the war. They cost little, they risked little, yet their impact was profound. Where bombs destroyed cities, letters carried fragments of truth. Where tanks shattered armies, letters rebuilt bridges of humanity. They did not end the war, but they helped to shape the peace that followed. And so the story closes on a paradox. In a war defined by destruction, one of America's strongest weapons was its willingness to allow the enemy to speak, to write, to remain human. It was not weakness but confidence, not softness but strategy. By giving German prisoners the chance to send words of reassurance, America revealed a kind of power that terrified as much as it comforted. For those who held the letters, whether in a camp in Texas or in a ruined street in Cologne, the message was clear. There was another way of life beyond fear and cruelty. A way that would, in the decades to come, shape the future of Europe itself. And so we are left with a question that lingers beyond this story. If something as simple as a letter could alter hearts and minds during the bloodiest war in history, what other overlooked acts of humanity shaped its outcome? Perhaps, in the next story, we will follow another thread: how Japanese prisoners, or even civilians in occupied lands, experienced captivity and communication. The war may have been fought with guns and tanks, but it was also fought with words, with choices, with small acts that carried echoes far into the future.